Welcome to the presentation of Group 2, and today we will talk to you about property markets in the Asia-Pacific region. Aim of today's presentation is to examine property markets of Singapore, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam.
For our analysis of the property market in Singapore, we will be focusing on the public housing sector as it plays a critical role in housing the population of the Southeast Asian city-state. So let's start off with some background information on Singapore. With a population of over 5.5 million people compared to Hong Kong's 7.2 million, Singapore is an advanced developing country and it has a GDP of US $469 billion. So it has a modest GDP growth rate of 2.2% in 2015 and an inflation rate of 0.5%. On a per capita basis though, Singapore has a higher population density than Hong Kong, and as you may already know, the two cities are often compared due to their similar economies. But there are a number of key differences specific to the public housing sector, and I'll be discussing those in my presentation. The housing policy in Singapore demonstrates the existence of the visible hand of government intervention. Under Singapore's public housing policy, low-income renters are given the opportunity to eventually own their own flat one day. A unique characteristic of the Singapore housing market is that it's virtually closed to all foreign investment, unlike that of Hong Kong. This limits the demand for housing flats from foreign investors in neighboring countries, namely China, and it keeps prices lower for Singaporeans. The government institution that offers public housing to Singaporeans is called the Housing and Development Board, or HDB for short. In Singapore, a staggering 85% of the population live in public housing flats, out of which 90% of them are owned by the residents. This means that 9 out of 10 residents in a typical Singapore public housing flat own their property rather than renting it on a month-to-month basis. This is quite different from Hong Kong, where about 50% of the population live in public housing flats. So the bottom line is that Singaporeans are encouraged by the HDB to eventually own their flats one day. Being such a small country where space is obviously a premium, Singapore spends many resources on allocating land for its growing population, which is largely affected by its liberal immigration policies. By the year 2030, the population is expected to grow to 6.5 to 6.9 million people. This map shows the residential zoning, amongst other zoning laws, for the city in orange. The government has historically also used land reclamation to add to its usable land. Singapore certainly puts a lot of pride into city planning for its future generations. This chart shows the different land use categories and their expected growth rates through 2030. You can pause for a moment to analyze the numbers yourself, but the largest expected growth is expected to be in industry and commerce by 4%, housing by 3%, and ports and airports by 3%. This reflects Singapore's position as a large Asian trading hub. The total land area in Singapore is smaller than that of Hong Kong. The terrain is also much flatter in Singapore compared to Hong Kong's mountains, which makes it much more usable and gives it greater space for development. This is the main reason why Singapore has a higher population density than Hong Kong, and this chart highlights some of the statistics for Singapore's stronger public housing numbers, as well as the greater living space that Singaporeans enjoy compared to Hong Kongers. One of the negative impacts of Singapore's housing policies are that the subsidized rent levels are positively correlated to household income. This means that residents are incentivized to limit their earnings in order to continue paying a lower level of subsidized rents to the government. Lastly, this case study presents an example of Singapore's public housing buildings called the Pinnacle at Duxton. This crown jewel of Singapore's HDB is the world's tallest set of public housing buildings located near Singapore's financial district. Its design was chosen from an international competition for public housing design, and the development showcases the HDB's commitment to creating high-quality public housing for Singaporeans.
Now we'll be talking about the property markets in South Korea. So let's start off with a brief overview of the Republic of Korea. It has a population of 51.5 billion people, a GDP of 1.85 trillion, a growth rate of 3.1% in 2015, and an inflation rate of 1% in 2015. In order to understand the property markets in South Korea, we first need to understand the Shonsei system. This is a leasing system where the renter pays the property owner and lump sum of 50% or as high as 80% of the market price of that property and gets to live in the property monthly rent free for as long as a contract is established. The system's adaptation to the property markets is due to the ever-rising prices in the property, due to the lack of properties in the past, which made properties inaccessible to some people, and the lack of mortgages, which makes the payment for these properties more accessible. It also has a cultural implication of respect between both parties since they both own part of this property. Now, due to some implications on the market, the wholesale system is also coming to a rise. The system is a bit more traditional than Chonsei, since the renter pays about 10% of the market price, which could be seen as a down payment, and then a monthly fee for the duration of the lease. As we can see on the bar chart, the property markets of Korea have started to see a decrease in ownership throughout the years, and an increase in Chonsei and wholesale. This is due to the lack of properties in the past and an increase in prices of the properties. Keeping in mind that the public housing system is not as established in South Korea as it is in other countries like Singapore and Hong Kong, most people end up trying to own their own property, and up to 55% of people own their own home. By 2010, property purchases had dropped significantly due to oversupply of properties and an increase in prices in these, but has since recovered by keeping the prices stable throughout the year since 2010. In this line graph, we can see the housing price index and the consumer price index since 1986 to 2008. Although at first we see them being next to each other, we can see how throughout the past 10 years or so, the housing price index has gone way higher than the consumer price index, meaning that a lot of people are not willing to pay for the prices of these properties, and it's out of their reach. In this chart, we can see the house price change from 2005 to 2015. We can see that in 2007 and 2008, it reached its peak, and then by 2009, when the housing bubble burst, it decreased, as we can see in 2010. Now, a lot of economists say that the prices are stabilizing to what they should be, and that's why you can see a slight recovery in the past few years. So what caused a lot of these rises and falls in the housing market was the falling of interest rate from the banks. So due to this, the Jonsei system struggles and causes a lot of the contracts that usually would ask for 50% deposit on the property market to go all the way up to 90%, which makes it extremely inaccessible to the people. Also, in 2008, property prices stagnated, and some property areas started to lower their value. And this was due to the oversupply of properties. And if there was no increase in demand, people didn't want to purchase these houses or rent these houses. Also, there was an increase in property purchase, the stable price. So by 2013, they're starting to see a recovery in the property housing market with people trying to buy houses again. The problem is that the prices of these houses had to stay stable from 2010 and on in order to attract these customers to buy these properties. It no longer could increase further because people would not want to buy these properties or even pay an extremely high Jonsei for it.
Following, we will provide an analysis of the Japanese property market. Japan is one of the most developed countries in the world. With a population of 172 million and a GDP of US 5.8 trillion, the country has the third biggest economy in the world. In 2015, the GDP growth rate was 0.3% and the inflation rate was 0.7%. If we take a closer look at the Japanese property market, one can see that 93% are private housing, whereas only 4% are public housing and 3% are company housing. Therefore, the following analysis will focus on the private housing market of Japan. Economist House Price Index. The Japanese house prices have developed differently compared to the development of the house prices of other developed countries like the United States or Britain. Since the last 2 decades, Japanese house prices are continuously falling. Giving a closer look at this chart and comparing the development of the house prices in Japan with other Asian countries, Japan is the only country with falling house prices in Asia in the last years, whereas Hong Kong and Malaysia experienced an enormous increase of the prices in their property market. Therefore, one should ask the question, what are the key reasons for this development? Now I would like to take a look at the current state of the Japanese private housing market. There are 54 million housing units, where 7 million of them are surplus. The average number of rooms is 4.77, and in general, renting apartments is much more common in cities than buying them. Overall, the home ownership rate accounts 60%, which is compared to other countries, as you can see in the figure, quite low. Even though prices were falling in the last 2 decades, in recent years the Japanese housing market seems to recover and stabilize, as you can see in this figure. Despite a weak economy and a shrinking population, the initiative taken by the Japanese government, the so-called Abenomics, is pushing house prices up. The Abenomics include increasing public infrastructure spending, devaluing the yen, and aggressive quantitative easing by the Bank of Japan. The outcomes so far are that the yen has fallen by 38% in the last year. However, the economy is hardly moving and growth expectations couldn't be met in the last year. Nevertheless, housing demand is stable and house prices are rising rapidly in some parts of the country. Especially in the urban areas, house prices are expected to continue rising in future. This is mainly caused by 2 reasons. First, the successful bid to host the 2020 Summer Olympics should boost the property demand and construction over the next 7 years, especially in Tokyo. And second, housing loans from domestically licensed banks rose by 10% from the previous year in 2015 through Abenomics and the low interest rates on loans. Last but not least, I would like to highlight the major parameters which will affect the Japanese housing market in future. First, the shrinking population is a major problem for Japan. As Japan will lose 1/3 of its population in the next 50 years, the shrinking population will produce an increasing surplus of housing units, which will definitely be a threat for house prices in future. However, as countermeasure, declining household size may mitigate the situation of falling house prices. Additionally, urban areas will be less affected than rural areas as the degree of urbanization is constantly increasing. Lastly, Abenomics might cause a housing bubble in future, which could have serious effects on the Japanese economy. As you can see in this quote, nowadays even a lot of experts are worried that the Abenomics could cause a housing bubble with severe effects on the overall economy.
And now we will examine the property markets of Thailand. Thailand's population is approximately 68 million people, while the GDP is $373.5 billion US, and the GDP is growing at a rate of 2.5%, while the inflation rate is 0.8%. All the data points are taken from the year of 2015. Property markets in Thailand are divided into 2 sectors, private and public. The largest sector is private, which is about 70%, and it meets the housing needs of the upper income class, while public sector meets the housing needs of the lower income class, and government gets heavily involved to alleviate the housing problem because the population in Thailand increased dramatically in the past couple of years. So in order to do that, the government created different government offices such as Housing Division, Government Housing Bank, Housing Office. However, all these government agencies were not enough to help to alleviate the problem, so the government created a national housing authority. In addition, Thailand has a property tax of 12.5%, which is paid annually at a flat rate.